New section. Oh, sorry. This is video. This is video 3 of chapter 2 of part 3 of Negative Dialectics. Part 3 is titled Models. Chapter 2 is titled World Spirit and Natural History, an Excursion to Hegel. So now I can start the new section. Universal History is the title of the new section. The concept of universal history, a concept whose validity inspired Hegelian philosophy in similar fashion as that of the mathematical natural sciences had inspired the Kantian one, became the more problematical the closer the unified world came to being a total process. On the other hand, a positivistically advanced historical science has splintered the conception of totality and unbroken continuity. The advantage which constructive philosophy enjoyed over that science was the dubious one of knowing less detail, an advantage easy enough to enter as, quote, sovereign distance, end quote, on the credit side of the ledger. At the same time, of course, there was less fear of saying essential things, the things that are outlined at a distance only. On the other hand, advanced philosophy was bound to note the understanding between universal history and ideology, and the discontinuous character of blighted life. Hegel himself had conceived universal history as unified merely on account of its contradictions. The materialistic turnabout in dialectics cast the weightiest accent on insight into the discontinuity of what is not comfortingly held together by any unity of spirit and concept. Yet discontinuity and universal history must be conceived together. To strike out the latter as a relic of metaphysical superstition would spiritually consolidate pure facticity as the only thing to be known and therefore to be accepted. It would do this exactly in the manner in which sovereignty, aligning facts in the order of the total march of one, capital O in that one, capital O, one spirit, used to confirm them as the utterances of that spirit. Universal history must be construed and denied. After the catastrophes that have happened and in view of the catastrophes to come, it would be cynical to say that a plan for a better world is manifested in history and unites it. Not to be denied for that reason, however, is the unity that cements the discontinuous, chaotically splintered moments and phases of history, the unity of the control of nature, progressing to rule over men, and finally to that over men's inner nature. No universal history leads from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. It ends in the total menace which organized mankind poses to organized men, in the epitome of discontinuity. Is the horror that verifies Hegel and stands him on his head, if he transfigures the totality of historic suffering into the positivity of the self-realizing absolute, the one and all that keeps rolling on to this day, with occasional breathing spells, would teleologically be the absolute of suffering. History is the unity of continuity and discontinuity. Society stays alive, not despite its antagonism, but by means of its antagonism. The profit interest and thus the class relationship make up the objective motor of the production process, which the life of all men hangs by, and the primacy of which has its vanishing point in the death of all. This also implies the reconciling side of the irreconcilable, since nothing else permits men to live. Not even a changed life would be possible without it. What historically made this possibility may as well destroy it. The world's spirit, a worthy object of definition, would have to be defined as permanent catastrophe. Under the all-subjugating identity principle, whatever does not enter into identity, whatever eludes rational planning in the realm of means, turns into frightening retribution for the calamity which identity brought on the non-identical. There is hardly an other way to interpret history philosophically without enchanting it into an idea. New section, antagonism contingent, question mark? It is not idle to speculate whether antagonism was inherited in the origin of human society as a principle of homo homini lupus, a piece of prolonged natural history, or whether it evolved, some word in Greek, and whether, even if evolved, it followed from the necessities of the survival of the species, and not contingently, as it were, from archaic arbitrary acts of seizing power. With that, of course, the construction of the world spirit would fall apart. The historic universal, the logic of things that is compacted in the necessity of the overall trend, would rest on something accidental, on something extraneous to it. It need not have been. Not only Hegel but Marx and Engels, whose idealism was hardly anywhere as pronounced as in the relation to totality, would have rejected all doubts of the inevitability of totality. No one who means to change the world can help feeling such doubts, but Marx and Engels would have warded them off like fatal attacks on their own system rather than upon the ruling system. Marx, of course, suspects all anthropology and carefully refrains from locating antagonism in human nature or in primitive times, which he paints according to the cliché of the Golden Age. Rather, but this makes him only more stubborn in his insistence on the historical necessity of antagonism. Economics is said to come before dominion, but must not be deduced otherwise than economically. The argument is scarcely to be settled with the aid of facts. They fade away in the mist of primitive history. Probably, however, the interest in it was no more concerned with historical facts than once upon a time the interest in social contract, which even Hobbes and Locke will hardly have regarded as really agreed upon. Footnote. The imaginary social contract was so welcome to the early bourgeois thinkers because its fundament, its legal form a priori, was the barter relationship of bourgeois rationality. Yet it was as imaginary as the bourgeois ratio itself was in the non-transparent real society. End footnote. It was a matter of deifying history, even to the atheistic Hegelians, Marx and Engels. The primacy of economics is to yield historically stringent reasons why the happy end is imminent in history. The economic process, we hear, produces the conditions of political rule and keeps overturning them until the inevitable deliverance from the compulsion of economics. Yet the doctrinal intransigence, in Engels' case in particular, was precisely political. The revolution desired by Engels and Marx was one of economic conditions in society as a whole, in the basic stratum of its self-preservation. It was not revolution as a change in society's political form, in the rules of the game of dominion. Their point was directed against the anarchists. When Marx and Engels decided to translate even mankind's primal history, its original sin, so to speak, into political economy, although the concept of that very discipline, chained to the totality of the barter relationship, is a late phenomenon, the motive that swayed them was the expectation of revolution as directly imminent. They wanted the revolution to come next day, hence their acute interest in breaking up trends that would, they had to fear, be crushed like Spartacus once upon a time, or like the peasant uprisings. Marx and Engels were enemies of utopia for the sake of its realization. Their imago of the revolution put its stamp upon the image of the primal world. The overwhelming weight of the economic contradictions in capitalism seemed to call for its derivation from the accumulated objectivity of what had been historically stronger since time immemorial. They could not foresee what became apparent later, in the revolution's failure, even where it succeeded. That domination may outlast the planned economy, which the two of them, of course, had not confused with state capitalism, a potential whereby the antagonistic trend shown by Marx and Engels, the antagonism of economics toward mere politics, is extended beyond the specific phase of that economics. By its tenacious survival after the downfall of what had been the main object of the critique of political economy, dominion helped an ideology to a cheap triumph. The ideology that will deduce dominion either from such allegedly inalienable forms of social organization, as centralization for instance, or from forms of consciousness abstracted out of the real process, the ratio. This is the ideology which then, in open agreement or under crocodile tears, will prophesy dominion and infinite future for as long as any organized society exists. Against this there remains the vigorous critique of a politics fetishized into being in itself, or of a spirit bloated in its particularity. Touched upon by events of the 20th century, however, is the idea of historic totality as a calculable economic necessity. Only if things might have gone differently, if the totality is recognized as a socially necessary semblance, as the hypostasis of the universal pressed out of individual human beings. If its claim to be absolute is broken, only then will a critical social consciousness retain its freedom to think that things might be different someday. Theory cannot shift the huge weight of the historic necessity unless the necessity has been recognized as realized appearance and historic determination is known as a metaphysical accident. Such cognition is frustrated by the metaphysics of history. More in line with the catastrophe that impends is the supposition of an irrational catastrophe in the beginning. Today, the thwarted possibility of something other has shrunk to that of averting catastrophe in spite of everything. New section, supramundane character of the Hegelian world spirit. By Hegel, however, notably by the Hegel of philosophy of history and the book Philosophy of Law, the historical objectivity that happened to come about is exalted into transcendence. Quote, this universal substance is not the mundane. The mundane impotently strives against it. No individual can get beyond this substance. He can differ from other individuals, but not from the popular spirit, end quote. Hegel. The opposite of the, quote, mundane, end quote, the identity to which the particular entity is unidentically doomed, would thus be supramundane. There is a grain of truth even in such ideology. The critic of his own popular spirit is also chained to what is commensurable to him, as long as mankind is splintered into nations. In the recent past, the greatest, though most disparagingly garbed model of this has been the constellation between Karl Kraus and Vienna. But to Hegel, as always, when he meets with something contrary, things are not that dialectical. The individual, he goes on, quote, may have more esprit than many others, but he cannot surpass the popular spirit. L'esprit, or esprit, I don't know if I'm saying that right. I'm probably saying it wrong. It's probably esprit. L'esprit are merely those who know about their people's spirit and know how to go by it, end quote. Hegel. With a malice that one cannot fail to hear in the use of the word esprit, the relationship is described far beneath the level of the Hegelian conception, quote, to go by it, end quote, would be literally nothing but to adjust. Like one confessing compulsively, Hegel deciphers his previously taught affirmative identity as a continuing break and postulates the submission of the weak to the more powerful. Euphemisms such as that in the book Philosophy of History, that in the course of world history, quote, some individuals have been hurt, end quote, are involuntary approaches to a sense of non-reconcilement, and the trumpet call, quote, duty is the individual's liberation to substantial freedom, end quote. A common property of German thought, by the way, already defies distinction from its parody in the doctor scene from Buchner's Voyzak. I think that's a I think there's a Werner Herzog movie of that. If I remember correctly, I remember it being good. I don't know. Maybe I didn't see that. What Hegel puts into philosophy's mouth is, quote, that no power surpasses that of the God. Excuse me. Let me repeat that. Let me blow my nose real quick, actually. These allergies or something else. What Hegel puts into philosophy's mouth is, quote, that no power surpasses that of the good of God and keeps him from prevailing. That God is borne out. That world history represents nothing but the plan of providence. God rules the world. The content of his rule, the execution of his plan, is world history. To comprehend this plan is the philosophy of world history, and its premise is that the ideal is accomplished, that only that which is in line with the idea has reality. End quote. Hegel. The world spirit seems to have worked in pretty cunning fashion when Hegel, as if to crown his edifying homily, to use Arnold Schoenberg's phrase, apes Heidegger in advance, quote, for reason is the perceiving of the divine work, end quote. The omnipotent thought has to abdicate and to make itself complacent as mere perceiving. To gild the heteronomy of the substantially universal, Hegel mobilizes Greek conceptions this side of experienced individuality. In such passages, he vaults all historic dialectics and unhesitatingly proclaims that morality's form in antiquity, the form which was first that of official Greek philosophy, and then the one of German gymnasian, I don't know if I'm saying that, or gymnasian, I don't know, is its true form, quote, for the morality of the state is not the moralistic, reflected one in which one's own convictions hold sway. This is more accessible to the modern world, while the true morality of antiquity has its roots in every man's stand by his duty, end quote. The objective spirit takes revenge on Hegel. As memorial orator of Spartanism, he anticipates the jargon of intrinsicality by 100 years with the term, quote, stand by his duty, end quote. He stoops to offering victims decorative comfort without touching on the substantiality of the conditions whose victims they are. What spooks there, behind his superior declarations, had previously been petty cash in the bourgeois till of Schiller, in whose, quote, Song of the Bell, end quote, the paterfamilias, burned out of house and home, is not only sent wandering, i.e. begging, but told to do it merrily, to boot. For a nation, said to be worthless otherwise, Schiller prescribes joy in committing its all to its honor. The terror of good cheer internalizes the contrite sociale. But such exaggeration is not a poetic luxury. The idealistic social pedagogue must do something extra, since without the performance of additional and irrational identification, it would be all too flagrant that the universal robs the particular of what it is being promised. Hegel associates the power of the universal with the aesthetically formal concept of greatness. Quote, these are people's great men. They guide the people in accordance with the universal spirit. For us, the individualities disappear and are noteworthy only as those who realize the will of the popular spirit, end quote. The blithely decreed disappearance of individualities, a negative which philosophy presumes to know as positive without any real change having occurred in it, is the equivalent of the continuing break. The power of the world spirit sabotages what a subsequent Hegelian passage extols in the individual, quote, that he is in line with his substance is due to himself, end quote. And yet the phrasing of the dismissal touches on serious matters. The world spirit is said to be, quote, the spirit of the world as it explicates itself In human consciousness, men relate to it as individuals to the whole, that is, their substance, end quote. Here Hegel is telling off the bourgeois conception of the individual, its vulgar nominalism, the very grimness which a man clings to himself, as to the immediately sure and substantial, makes him an agent of the universal, and individuality a deceptive notion. On this Hegel agreed with Schopenhauer. What he had over Schopenhauer was the insight that the abstract negation of individuality is not all there is to the dialectics of individuation and universality. The remaining objection, however, not just against Schopenhauer but against Hegel himself, is that the individual, the necessary phenomenon of the essence, the objective tendency, is right to turn against that tendency, since he confronts it with its externality and fallibility. This is implicit in Hegel's doctrine of the individual's substantiality, quote, by way of himself, end quote. Yet instead of developing the doctrine, Hegel sticks to an abstract antithesis of universal and particular, an antithesis that ought to be unbearable to his own method. Footnote. Among the positivists, it was in Emile Durkheim's doctrine of collective spirit that Hegel's choice in favor of the universal was maintained and topped. If possible, in Durkheim's schema there is no more room for a dialectic of universal and particular, even in the abstract. In the sociology of primitive religions, Durkheim made the substantial discovery that qualities, the things the particular is boasting of, have been imposed upon it by the universal. He designates to the universal both the delusion of the particular as a mere mimesis and the power that makes a particular of it in the first place. Emile Durkheim. End footnote. I don't know why I said it, and Emile Durkheim like that was a quote. But there's a quote here, and it's all in French, so I'm not even going to read it. So, moving on, end footnote. Hegel siding with the universal. Opposed to such a separation of substantiality and individuality, as much as to a narrowly immediate consciousness, is the insight of Hegelian logic into the unity of the particular and the universal, a unity which sometimes strikes him as identity. Quote, particularity, however, as universality, is such an immanent relation in and for itself, not by way of transition. It is totality in itself and simple definition, essentially a principle. It has no other definition than the one posited by the universal itself and resulting from the universal as follows. The particular is the universal itself, but it is the universal's difference from or relation to something else, what it seems to be on the outside. But there exists nothing else from which the particular might differ, nothing but the universal itself. When the universal is defined, it is the particular. Definition makes the difference. It differs only from itself. End quote. Hegel. Immediately then, the particular would be the universal, because it can find no definition of its particularity except by way of the universal only, without the universal. Hegel concludes in an ever-recurring mode, the particular is nothing. The modern history of the human spirit, and not that alone, has been an apologetic labor of Sisyphus, thinking away the negative side of the universal. The Kantian spirit still remembers it. As against necessity, Kant tried to confine necessity to nature. The Hegelian critique of necessity is removed by legerdemain. Quote, the consciousness of the spirit must form in the world, the material, the soil. Of this realization is nothing but the universal consciousness. the consciousness of a people. This consciousness contains and directs all of the people's purposes and interests. It makes up the people's rights, customs, religions. It is the substantial part of a people's spirit, even if the individuals do not know it, even if it stands as a settled premise. It is like a necessity. The individual is raised in this atmosphere and knows of nothing else. Yet it is not merely education and a consequence of education. Rather, this consciousness is developed by the individual himself, not taught to him. The individual has his being in that substance. End quote. Hegel. The Hegelian phrasing, quote, it is like a necessity, end quote, is very adequate to the preponderance of the universal. The, quote, like, suggested the merely metaphorical character of such a necessity, fleetingly touches on the semblance character of that which is the most real of things, doubts whether necessity is good are promptly knocked down with the avowal that, rain or shine, necessity is freedom. The individual, Hegel tells us, quote, has his being in that substance, end quote, in the universal which to him was still coinciding with the popular spirits. But its positivity itself is negative, and the more negative its bearing, the more positive it will be. The unity gets worse as its seizure of plurality becomes more thorough. It has its praise bestowed on it by the victor, and even a spiritual victor will not do without his triumphal parade, without the ostentatious pretense that what is incessantly inflicted upon the many is the meaning of the world. Quote, it is the particular which fights each other to exhaustion, and a part of which is ruined, but it is precisely from struggle, from the fall of the particular, that the universal results. The individual is not disturbed, end quote. Hegel. It has not been disturbed to this day, and yet, according to Hegel, without the particular that defines it, as a thing detached from itself, there would be no universal either. There is only one way for Hegelian logic to succinctly identify a universal and an undefined particular, to equate cognition with the fact that the two poles are mediated, and that is for logic, which Hegel also views as an a priori doctrine of general structures, not to deal with the particular as a particular at all. His logic deals only with particularity, which is already conceptual. Thus established, the logical primacy of the universal provides a fundament for the social and political primacy that Hegel is opting for. This much should be granted to Hegel. Not only particularity, but the particular itself is unthinkable without the moment of the universal, which differentiates the particular, puts its imprint on it, and in a sense is needed to make a particular of it. But the fact that dialectically one moment needs the other, the moment contradictorily opposed to it, this fact, as Hegel knew well but liked to forget on occasion, reduces neither moment to a, some word in Greek. Stipulated otherwise would be the absolute, ontological validity of the logic of pure non-contradictoriness, which the dialectical demonstration of, quote, moments had broken through. Ultimately stipulated would be the position of an absolute first, the concept, with the fact said to be secondary because according to our idealistic tradition it, quote, follows from the concept of a particular nothing can be predicated without definition and thus without universality, and yet this does not submerge the moment of something particular, something opaque, which that prediction refers to and is based upon. It is maintained within the constellation, else dialectics would end up hypostatizing mediation without preserving the moments of immediacy, as Hegel prudently wished to do everywhere else. New section, relapse into Platonism. The imminent critique of dialectics explodes Hegel's idealism. Cognition aims at the particular, not at the universal. It seeks its true object in the possible determination of the difference of that particular, even from the universal, which it criticizes as nonetheless inalienable. But if the mediation of the universal by the particular, and of the particular by the universal, is reduced to the abstract normal form of mediation as such, the particular has to pay the price, down to its authoritarian dismissal in the material parts of the Hegelian system. Quote, what man must do, what are the duties he has to fulfill to be virtuous, is easily told in a moral community. He has to do nothing other than is prescribed, expressed and known to him in his circumstances. Probity is the universal that can be demanded of him, partly legally, partly morally. From the moral standpoint, however, it tends to appear as something subordinate, beyond which one ought to ask more of himself and of others. For the urge to be something particular is not contented by that which is in and for itself and universal. It is only in an exception that this urge will find the sense of intrinsicality. Unquote. Hegel. If Hegel had carried the doctrine of the identity of universal and particular farther, to a dialectic in the particular itself, the particular, which according to him is simply the mediated universal, would have been granted the same right as the universal. That he depreciates this right into a mere urge and psychologically blackens the right of man as narcissism, like a father chiding his son, quote, maybe you think you're something special, unquote. This is not an individual lapse on the philosopher's part. Idealistically, there is no carrying out the dialectic of the particular which he envisions. Contrary to the Kantian truismos, philosophy is not supposed to make itself at home in the universal as a doctrine of forms. It is to penetrate the content itself. Rather, and this is why in a grandiosely fatal petitio principii, reality is so arranged by philosophy that it will yield to the repressive identification with philosophy. What is most true in Hegelian thinking, the sense of the particular without whose weight the concept of reality decays into a farce, leads to that which is most false. It removes the particular for which Hegel's philosophy is groping. The more insistently his concept strives for reality, the more benightedly is reality. The hic et nunc that should be cracked open as gilded nuts are cracked by children on a holiday, contaminated by him with the concept that covers it. Quote, it is this very attitude of philosophy toward reality which the misconceptions affect, and so I come back to what I said before, that philosophy, because it means to fathom what is rational, means precisely therefore to grasp what is present and real, not to erect a beyond, said to be God knows where, or of which one can in fact say very well where it is, namely in the error of empty, one-sided rationalizing, ... When reflection, feeling, or whatever form the subjective consciousness may take, regards the present as vain, when it goes beyond the present and knows better, it is likewise vain in being only real in the present. It is nothing but vanity. Conversely, if the idea is taken to be no more than just an idea, a concept held as an opinion, philosophy affords the insight that nothing but the idea is a reality. What matters then is that in the semblance of the temporal and transitory, we may know the substance which is immanent, and the eternal which is present. End quote. Footnote. The cliche, quote, only an idea, end quote, had already been criticized by Kant. Quote, the Platonic Republic has become proverbial as a supposedly striking instance of imagined perfection, which can be located only in an idle thinker's brain, ... One would do better, however, to pursue this thought some more, and, where the excellent man leaves us without assistance, to illuminate it by new efforts instead of putting it aside as useless, on the very wretched and harmful pretext that it is unfeasible. End quote. Kant. End footnote. So Platonic of necessity is the dialectician's language. The dialectician will not admit that, from the point of view of logic as well as of the philosophy of history, the universal contracts into the particular, until the latter breaks loose from the abstract universality that has grown extraneous to it, while the universal he vindicates as a higher objectivity correlatively declines to a bad subjectivity, to the mean value of particularities. He who set upon a transition of logic to time is now resigned to timeless logic. New section. Temporalization of time. The simple dichotomy of temporality and eternity, amidst and despite the Hegelian conception of dialectics, conforms to the primacy of the universal in Hegel's philosophy of history. Just as the general concept, the fruit of abstraction, is deemed above time, and just as the loss which the subsumed suffers by the process of abstraction is entered in the prophet column as a draft on eternity, are so history's allegedly supratemporal moments turned into positiva. Hidden in them is the old evil, however. To agree to the perpetuation of the status quo is to discredit the protesting thought as ephemeral. Such an about-face into timelessness is not extraneous to Hegel's dialectics and philosophy of history. As his version of dialectics extends to time itself, time is ontologized, turned from a subjective form into a structure of being as such, itself eternal. Based on this are Hegel's speculations which equate the absolute idea of totality with the passing of everything finite. His attempt to deduce time, as it were, and to eternalize it as permitting nothing outside it, is as much in line with this conception as with absolute idealism, which can no more resign itself to the separation of time and logic than Kant could to the separation of the visuality and intellect. There again, by the way, Hegel, Kant's critic, was Kant's executor. When Kant turns time, as the pure visual form and premise of everything temporal, into an a priori, time on its part is exempted from time. Footnote. Quote, time does not pass, but the existence of changeable things passes in time. Since time itself is immutable and enduring, what corresponds to it in phenomenality is the immutable in existence, i.e. substance, and it is by this alone that we can determine the sequence and simultaneity of the phenomena in time. End quote. Kant. End footnote. Subjective and objective idealism concur in this, for the basic stratum of both is the subject as a concept, devoid of its temporal content. Once again, as to Aristotle, the actus purus becomes that which does not move. The social partisanship of the idealists goes all the way down to the constituents of their systems. They glorify time as timeless, history as eternal, all for fear that history might begin. For Hegel, the dialectic of time and temporality logically turns into a dialectic of time in itself. Footnote. Quote, more closely then, the real I itself belongs to time, with which, if we abstract from the concrete content of consciousness and self-consciousness, it coincides, being nothing but this empty motion of positing myself as something other, and voiding this change, I preserving therein myself, the I, and only the I as such. I is in time, and time is the being of the subject. End quote. Hegel. End footnote. It offers the positivists their favored point of attack. In fact, it would be bad scholasticism if dialectics were attributed to the formal concept of time, with every temporal content expurgated. In critical reflection, however, time is dialecticized as the internally mediated unity of form and content. Kant's transcendental aesthetics would have no answer to the objection that the purely formal character of time as a, quote, form of visuality, and, quote, its, quote, emptiness, and, quote, has itself no corresponding visuality whatever. Kantian time defies every possible conception and imagination. To conceive it, we always have to conceive something temporal along with it, something to read it off on, something that permits its passage or its so-called flow to be experienced. The fact is that the conception of pure time does require the very conceptual mediation, the abstraction from all conceptions of time that can be carried out, from which Kant, for the sake of systematics, the disjunction of sensibility and intellect, wished and needed to relieve the forms of visuality. Absolute time is such, bereft of the last factual substrate that is and passes in it, would no longer be that time, according to Kant, but let me repeat that, sorry. Had to stretch. It's like a yawn stretch. Absolute time is such, bereft of the last factual substrate that is and passes in it, would no longer be what time, according to Kant, must inalienably be. It would no longer be dynamic. There is no dynamics without that in which it occurs. Conversely, however, a factuality without its place in the time continuum is not conceivable either. Dialectics carries this reciprocity into the most formal realm of the moments essential to that realm, and, opposed to each other, not one is without the other. Yet the reciprocity is not motivated by the pure form in itself that served to reveal it. A relationship of form and content has become the form itself. It is inalienably the form of a content, an extreme sublimation of the form-content dualism in detached and absolutized subjectivity. An element of truth might be squeezed out of Hegel's theory of time, provided one will not let logic produce time by itself, as he does. To be perceived in logic instead are coagulated time relations, as indicated variously, if cryptically, in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, in the chapter on schematism in particular, preserved likewise in the Discursive Logic, the book. Unmistakably in its conclusions are time elements that were detemporalized as subjective thinking objectified them into pure legality. Without such detemporalization, on the other hand, time would not have been objectified at all. As cognition of an element, it would be compatible with Hegel to interpret the link between logic and time by going back to something which current positivistic science considers pre-logical in logic. For what Hegel calls synthesis is not simply the downright new quality leaping forth from definite negation. It is the return of what has been negated. Dialectical progress is always a recourse as well to that which fell victim to the progressing concept. The concept's progressing concretion is its self-correction. The transition of logic to time would like, as far as consciousness is able, to make up to time for the wrongs done to it by the logic without which, on the other hand, time would not be. Under this aspect, the Bergsonian duplication of the concept of time is a bit of dialectics unaware of itself. In the concept of le temps duré, of lived duration, Bergson tried theoretically to reconstruct the living experience of time, and thus its substantial element that had been sacrificed to the abstractions of philosophy and of causal mechanical natural science. Even so, he did not convert to the dialectical concept any more than science did. More positivistically than he knew in his polemicizing, He absolutized the dynamic element out of disgust with the rising reification of consciousness. He on his part made of it a form of consciousness, so to speak, a particular and privileged mode of cognition. He reified it, if you will, into a line of business. In isolation, the time of subjective experience, along with its content, comes to be as accidental and mediated as its subject, and therefore compared with chronometric time is always, quote, false also. Sufficient to elucidate this is the triviality that, measured by clock time, subjective time experiences invite delusion. Although there would be no clock time without the subjective time experience which the clock time objectifies. But the crass dichotomy of Bergson's two times does register the historic dichotomy between living experience and the objectified and repetitive labor process. His brittle doctrine of time is an early precipitation of the objective social crisis in the sense of time. The irreconcilability of temps duré and temps espace is the wound of that split consciousness whose only unity lies in being split. The naturalistic interpretation of temps espace can no more master this than the hypostasis of temps duré, in which the subject, flinching from reification, hopes in vain to preserve itself simply by being alive. The fact is that laughter, according to Bergson, the restoration of life from its conventional hardening, has long become the convention's weapon against uncomprehended life, against the traces of something natural that has not been quite domesticated. New section, Dialectics cut short by Hegel. Hegel's transposition of the particular into particularity follows the practice of a society that tolerates the particular only as a category, a form of the supremacy of the universal. Marx designated this state of facts in a manner which Hegel could not foresee. Quote, the dissolution of all products and activities into exchange values presupposes the dissolution of all fixed personal, historical dependencies in production, as well as the producer's universal dependence on each other. Every individual's production depends as much on the production of all others as the transformation of his product into food for himself has come to depend on the consumption of all others. ... This mutual interdependence is expressed in the constant necessity of exchange, and in the exchange value as universal mediator. The economist put it this way: everyone pursues his private interest and thus unwillingly and unwittingly serves the private interest of all, the general interest. The joke is not that everyone's pursuit of his private interest will in effect serve the entirety of private interest, that is, the general interest. From this abstract phrase, it might as well be inferred that everyone mutually inhibits the pursuit of others' interests, and that, instead of general affirmation, the result of this bellum omnium contra omnes, a war of all against all, will be general negation. The point is, rather, that the private interest itself is already a socially determined interest, one that can be pursued only on the terms laid down by society and by the means provided by society, hence an interest tied to the reproduction of those terms and means. It is the interest of private persons, but its content as well as the form and mediation, it is the private persons, but it is content as well as the form and means of realization are given by social conditions independent of them all. End quote. Marx. Such negative supremacy of the concept makes clear why Hegel, its apologist, and Marx, its critic, concur in the notion that what Hegel calls the world spirit has a preponderance of being in itself, that it does not, as would be solely fitting for Hegel, have merely its objective substance in the individuals. Quote, the individuals are subsumed under social production, which exists as a doom outside them, but social production is not subsumed under the individuals who exercise it as their common capacity. End quote. Marx. The real truismos obliges Hegel, much against his will, to remodel his thesis of the reality of the idea. The theory does not admit this, but there are unmistakable lines about it in the Philosophy of Law, the book Philosophy of Law. Quote, for the particular of the state, one must not look to particular states or particular institutions, rather the idea, this real God, must be contemplated by itself. Every state, although a man may call it bad according to the principles he holds, although he may find one or the other flaw in it, always contains the essential moments of its existence, especially if it is one of the developed states of our time. But because finding faults is easier than grasping the affirmative, one will easily fall into the error of letting specific sides make him forget the inner organism of the state itself. Quote. Hegel. The tenor of the whole work is to dispute away the contradiction between idea and reality. But if the idea, quote, must be contemplated by itself, end quote, not in, quote, particular states, end quote, and that in principle with an encompassing structure in mind, this resurrects the contradiction. In keeping with it is the ominous line that finding faults is easier than grasping the affirmative. Today, this has become the clamor for, quote, constructive criticism, end quote. In other words, groveling criticism. Because the identity of idea and reality is denied by reality. Ascertaining that identity nonetheless calls, so to speak, for an obsequious special effort on the part of reason. The, quote, affirmative, the proof of positively accomplished reconciliation, is postulated, praised as a superior achievement of consciousness, because Hegel's pure I, witness, does not suffice for such affirmation. The pressure which affirmation exerts on a bulky reality acts tirelessly to strengthen the real pressure put upon the subject by the universal, its negation. The chasm between the two yawns the more visibly, the more concretely the subject is confronted with the thesis of the objective substantiality of morals. In Hegel's late conception of education, this is described only as something hostile to the subject. Quote, absolutely defined, education is thus deliverance and the work on a higher deliverance, namely the absolute point of transition to the infinitely subjective substantiality of morals, which is no longer immediate and natural but spiritual, and likewise raised to the form of universality. In the subject, this deliverance is the toil of striving against mere subjectivity of conduct, against immediate desire, as well as against the subjective vanity of sensation and the arbitrariness of liking. That it is this toil accounts for part of the disfavor it encounters, but it is by this educational toil that subjective volition gains in itself the objectivity which alone makes it worthy and capable of being the reality of the idea, end quote. Hegel. Embroidering this is some word in Greek, the Greek school maxim which Goethe, whom it fitted least of all, did not disdain to choose as a Hegelian-minded motto for his autobiography. Yet in trumpeting the truth about the identity it would like first to bring about, the classicist maxim admits its own untruth, literally that of birch-rod pedagogy, and metaphorically that of the unspeakable commandment to submit. Being eminently untrue, the maxim is unfit for the purpose entrusted to it, psychology. Belittled by the great philosophy, knows more about that than philosophy knows. Brutality is reproduced by men against whom it is practiced. The abused are not educated but repressed, re-barbarized. An insight of psychoanalysis that civilization's repressive mechanisms transform the libido into aggression against civilization cannot be extinguished anymore. The man who has been educated by force will channel his aggressions by identifying with force to pass it on and get rid of it. It is thus that subject and object are really identified according to the educational ideal of Hegel's philosophy of law. If a culture is no culture, it does not even want the people who are caught in its mill to be cultured. In one of the most famous passages of the book, Philosophy of Law, Hegel cites a line attributed to Pythagoras, to the effect that the best way morally to educate a son is to make him a citizen of his state with good laws. This calls for a judgment whether the state itself and its laws are actually good. But Hegel, order is good a priori. It does not have to answer to those living under it. Ironically, this confirms Hegel's subsequent Aristotelian reminiscence that, quote, substantial unity is an absolute. Wait, how am I? Fuck, I lost my space. There's some squirrels fighting in the tree. But to Hegel, order is good a priori. It does not have to answer to those living under it. Ironically, this confirms his subsequent Aristotelian reminiscence that, quote, substantial unity is an absolute and motionless end in itself, unquote. Motionless, the end stands in the dialectic that is supposed to produce it. It is thus devalued to an empty avowal that, quote, freedom comes to its supreme right, unquote, in the state. Hegel lapses into that insipid edification which he still despised in phenomenology. He reiterates a cogitative cliché of antiquity, from the stage at which philosophy is victorious. Platonic Aristotelian mainstream proclaimed its solidarity at the institutions against their bases in the social process. All in all, mankind discovered society much later than the state, which is mediate as such but seems given and immediate to the governed. Hegel's line, quote, whatever man is, he owes to the state, unquote, Hegel. That most obvious hyperbole carries on the antiquated confusion. What induced the thesis is that the, quote, motionlessness, unquote, Hegel attributes to the general purpose might indeed be predicated of the institution once it is hardened, but could not possibly be predicted of society, which is dynamic in essence. The dialectician confirms the state's prerogative to be above dialectics because, a matter he did not delude himself about, dialectics will drive men beyond bourgeois society. He does not put his trust in dialectics, does not look upon it as the force to cure itself, and disavows his own assurance that identity will produce itself in dialectics. Okay, so that is the end of this video. I think it's, what's this, video 3? Of World Spirit and Natural History, an excursion to Hegel, which is chapter 2 of part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, part 3 being titled Models. Thank you so much for listening.